The California condor was added to the endangered species list on March 11, 1967. Despite efforts taken to protect the species and its habitat, the number of condors continued to decline. By 1982, only 22 individual condors remained in the wild. A decision was reached to take all remaining condors into captivity, and in 1987 the last condor was trapped, rendering the species extinct in the wild. The most recent management plan for condors was drafted in 1996. However, researchers have learned much about the condor's needs and behaviors since that time. Their methods have adapted without any updates being incorporated into the plan. Here I will discuss ongoing issues with the recovering plan and propose solutions to those problems. Changes could be made to the current recovery plan to ensure appropriate guidelines are being followed to hasten the recovery of the California condor. Habitat loss is a major factor in the decline of the California condor. Due to human development and the depletion of elk, pronghorn, and marine mammals, condors could no longer find adequate forage in their previous range. Their habitat shrank significantly until 1950, when only a small U-shaped region in Southern California was still home to condors. Ensuring all wild condors have sufficient access to nesting sites is crucial as the population continues to grow. Sufficient nesting areas such as cliffs and mountainous regions, or areas with large trees such as sequoia and redwood, must be present at future release sites. Though not territorial for feeding purposes, condors can be extremely territorial over nesting sites. Nests are typically placed at least 13 kilometers from another active nest site. If sufficient habitat is not made available to condors, captive breeding would have to continue indefinitely. The goal would be to establish a fully sustainable population in the wild without the need to continue captive breeding. Each site must be managed to ensure there is adequate nest availability as the population grows. In addition, any new site selected will require the correct conditions to produce the thermals necessary to support condors in flight. They will require protected sites with stretches of massive undeveloped areas where the condor can forage and nest with little risk of human disturbance. Lands protected by the federal government and indigenous tribes would be the most likely candidates as future release sites. Captive breeding allowed young condors to be released into the wild in 1992. Unfortunately, puppet-reared chicks showed excessive tameness and no fear of humans or human structures such as power lines. This led to increased mortality in captive-reared chicks when compared to previous studies of wild-born chicks. A program was initiated to haze young condors to scare them away from human areas, along with a program of aversive conditioning to electric poles. In spite of these efforts, 19 captive-reared condors were retrapped and returned to captivity permanently due to excessive human-oriented behavior. To prevent condor chicks from imprinting on humans, I would propose that each captive chick be isolated entirely from humans and raised entirely by the parents. Blinds would be constructed around all aviaries, and nutrition would be given through small doors using tongs so that human hands are not visible. In addition, I would add that only negative experiences be associated with humans, such as the application of wing tags and veterinary checkups. No unnecessary handling or prolonged amounts of time in human company would be allowed. Double clutching should be induced in the wild by removing eggs laid in the wild using foster parents in captivity to raise those chicks. To date, 17 condor chicks have been raised by single foster parent condors and released to the wild successfully. By allowing the chicks to be raised by a single captive parent, the number of chicks that can be raised each year increases as compared to being raised by pairs. A surplus of eggs can be obtained through double clutching from every mated pair in captivity as well, and given to a single foster parent condor. This should significantly increase the number of chicks produced each year. To encourage successful nesting in the wild, protections must be given to all release areas, including new areas that will be added in the future. Nest disturbances for removal of the first egg to induce double clutching, tagging of fledgling chicks, and intervention in the event of a medical emergency would be allowed. In no other instance should condor chicks be exposed to humans. Ultimately, many of the condors currently in captivity could be released to the wild once captive breeding is no longer needed. Their release will depend on how heavily imprinted they are on humans, which is why every effort must be taken to prevent imprinting in subsequent generations. Currently, it is necessary to provide supplemental feeding for condors at release sites due to a severely limited amount of foraging land. However, the natural behavior for condors is to forage hundreds of miles each day in search of food. Returning to the same supplemental feeding sites daily is not a natural behavior. Should the species recover enough to be removed from the endangered species list, the amount of management will decline, as will funding for projects involving the condor. That means supplemental feeding programs will have to be scaled back or ended at that time. Actions must be taken now to ensure condors have adequate foraging habitat and nutrition available. Condors prefer large ungulate carcasses, which is a difficult food source to provide in urban and agricultural areas. However, a supplemental program could be established to provide benefits to ranchers in the area to deceased stock on grazing lands for condor feeding. This action would not be considered a supplemental feeding site because death of livestock would be a random occurrence and carcasses would not be left at the same site each time. Carcasses would need to meet criteria to be labeled organic, eliminating the possibility of poisoning condors with antibiotics or other chemicals. Recreational hunters could also be given incentives to dispatch large prey species in the vicinity, but the carcasses would not be harvested by the hunter. Instead, they would be left for condors to feed. Only non-lead ammunition would be allowed to avoid any possibility of lead poisoning in condors. The carcasses would be left in random locations, allowing condors to discover it during their daily flights. Both the farmer and hunter scenarios allow condors to perform their natural behaviors of foraging and feeding. Another potential solution would depend on the restoration of large ungulates, such as bison, elk, deer, etc., in various open landscapes that are either managed federally or by indigenous tribes. Programs that restore ungulate species to protected grazeland or areas where they can migrate freely would be ideal. Those programs could be incorporated into the condor recovery plan, with the release sites that would allow condors to feed on the deceased ungulates. As of 2020, lead poisoning makes up 56% of known mortality among wild California condors. The ingestion of lead fragments from ammunition left in gut piles from hunted animals is the primary source of lead poisoning in condors. Despite the 2019 ban on lead ammunition in California, it continues to be the condor's leading cause of death. This might be due to the fact that lead ammunition is lower cost and more readily available, and hunters are still using it in the area. A system of punishments for the use of lead would likely meet with resistance and possible legal battles. Instead, I would propose a system of incentives for hunters and manufacturers to make the switch. Ammunition trade-in programs should be established by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, as well as the California Department of Conservation and other government and non-government organizations near condor release sites. Hunters can trade lead ammunition for non-toxic alternatives at no cost. At future release sites where lead ammunition is not yet banned, hunters can be offered incentives to bag the guts of hunted animals and remove them from the site. Also, an information campaign encouraging hunters to report shot but unretrieved animals to wardens so the animal can be located and removed from the site prior to ingestion by condors. I would also recommend a federal tax being added to lead ammunition. This tax would apply to consumers as well as manufacturers. Tax incentives would be offered to manufacturers who choose to produce non-toxic ammunition instead. This action could raise the price of lead ammunition while lowering the price of non-toxic alternatives, making it more affordable. Electrocution and collisions with wind turbines are also a known cause of mortality for condors as well as other birds of prey. As high as 9% mortality has been recorded due to electrocution, and 4 condors have died as a result of collisions with wind turbines. All new electric poles installed in condor territory must use raptor-friendly designs to minimize the risk of electrocution. All wind turbines near condor habitat must have a detection system to shut down when raptors are present to prevent collision deaths.